5 seconds to submergence. Submergence deep into the absurd.
Three, two, one. All right, this is Into the Absurd, episode 26 with Dr. Philip J. Walsh. He is a postdoctoral fellow and professor of philosophy at Fordham University. Welcome.
Fordham, yeah.
Fordham, sorry.
Yeah. Nice to be here, Greg. Thanks for having me.
So I was actually really excited for this podcast because you're not only a researcher in Eastern philosophy, but you're also a researcher in the ethics of AI and the philosophy of technology, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I guess I have pretty eclectic, wide-ranging interests. My area of specialization and my dissertation and a lot of my published work is on phenomenology and philosophy of mind. So, the phenomenological tradition. My favorites are Edmund Husserl and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the mid-20th century French philosopher. So I've written a lot about those two. And I'm usually writing about phenomenology in the context of current questions in contemporary philosophy of mind. So the questions about perception and perceptual knowledge, the nature of thought, linguistic expression, things like that. But yeah, so I do have a background in Chinese philosophy. I never really developed the competence in the linguistic competence, studying, classical Chinese language or anything. I never really developed that to really specialize in classical Chinese philosophy. But I got a master's degree at St. John's College, which is a great books program. And they have a one-year program called Eastern Classics that goes through some of the classic texts of India, China, and Japan. And since then, I've taught Chinese philosophy a few times. And I have one publication that does deal with Confucianism. So I enjoy classical Chinese philosophy and Buddhism to some extent, but kind of more focused on classical Confucian philosophy in that research area. And then also the philosophy of technology thing, that's something I've really been developing pretty recently, the past year, 2 years, again, from teaching courses on it. I've taught a couple courses at Fordham now. One's called Philosophy of Technology. The other one's called AI, Sci-Fi, and Human Values. And so just teaching those courses has been really fun and a great opportunity to explore those topics. So that's kind of the new area that I'm getting into.
So you found in your teachings and your research, have you found a connection between, say, AI and philosophy of technology and Eastern thought, Chinese philosophy?
Well, I'm sure there's connections to be made. I have not done any work. No. I mean, the answer to the question is no. I haven't found any sort of explicit connections that I want to pursue. But I mean, those are both really broad areas. So of course, there are definitely connections to be made in those areas, I'm sure. And I'm sure there's people out there already making them. I mean, just off the top of my head, I'll pull a book off my shelf right here that's within arm's reach. Shannon Valor is a really great philosopher who does philosophy of technology. She has a book called Technology and the Virtues. So it's exploring virtue ethics and philosophy of technology. And she talks about Confucian virtue ethics and maybe some Buddhism in there too, I forget. So insofar as Confucianism and Chinese philosophy in general have rich ethical traditions, then yes, of course, there are connections and applications to be made from that to, tech ethics or philosophy of technology. I know there's people doing work kind of on cross-cultural attitudes towards technology, how having, different cultural background, different philosophical background might lead people to have different attitudes towards different kinds of technology. I know there's probably work out there on that. But no, I mean, that's not something that I've really gone into much myself.
This is going to be a little out there, but I was listening to the Duncan Trussell Family Hour podcast, and the host was saying something about, I think it was the Dalai Lama. Someone asked him a question about whether if we were to create an artificial intelligent life form, I guess, in air quotes, life form, that had a consciousness and free will, just like human beings, then could that consciousness, or could something reincarnate into that life form, essentially? And it was interesting because the Dalai Lama, or whoever it was, some Buddhist monk, said that yes, something could reincarnate into this AI, right? And I know you do a lot of work with phenomenology and how the mind works and how we understand things in the world. And I want to know your opinion on if, say, theoretically, if that was the case, what would be your opinion on that as far as human nature and phenomenology goes?
Do I think that we could be reincarnated as AI, as conscious AI?
Yeah, I mean that, and also not necessarily that, but is a conscious AI, is that
possible?
human? Is that a human, right?
Okay, well, look, a lot of questions in there. Let's just start with the issue of consciousness and AI.
Yes.
Okay. So it depends on what you mean by consciousness. And there's lots of debates about whether AI could ever be conscious, how close we are to creating a conscious AI. And people mean different things by AI. So you're talking about AGI, artificial general intelligence. Right now, AI already exists because, people say that their health insurance software is powered by AI, or your Facebook newsfeed is powered by AI. So there's AI in that mundane sense of machine learning algorithms that do preference prediction or natural language processing or whatever, right? But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about AI that achieves a kind of general intelligence equal to or greater than human beings, right? So people call that AGI, artificial general intelligence. And then, okay, so is it possible? Yes, I think it's possible. Are we remotely close to anything like that? No, we're not. Further thing that needs to be disambiguated is AGI, or the concept of intelligence, and the concept of consciousness, because they don't mean the same thing. Okay, so I'm a phenomenologist, and so I'm interested in consciousness as it is understood by the concept of phenomenal consciousness. Are you familiar with that?
Not really. If you could go,
okay. Yeah, no
give
problem.
a brief explanation, that'd be great.
So the concept of consciousness is ambiguous, and people mean different things by it in different contexts. The classic distinction I'm using here is between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. It was made by Ned Block, a philosopher of mind at NYU, several decades ago. And it's more complex than this, but for the sake of discussion, it's a good place to start. So sometimes when people talk about consciousness, they mean something like awareness or certain abilities. Okay, so I'm aware of my current state. I can tell you if I'm in pain or not. I can tell you what position my limbs are in. I can report on my visual awareness. I can tell you what's in my field of vision, et cetera, et cetera. I can tell you what's on my mind. I can tell you if I'm having indigestion right now, right? So that's self-awareness. I'm self-aware because I can give you verbal reports on my current operating system state, if you will, okay? We can make computers that do that, right? We could make a machine, we could fashion an artificial intelligence that would have the capacity to self-monitor, right? To self-report on its own functioning, on its own states, okay? So I don't think that means it's conscious, okay? And that's why the concept of awareness is also not helpful here. Because if awareness just means the ability to monitor one's own internal states, then we can have a robot that does that, right? And we already have machines that do that in rudimentary forms, okay? So what are we talking about when I talk about consciousness? Well, I'm not talking, that's access consciousness. I'm not talking about just the ability to verbally report and monitor internal states. I'm talking about phenomenal consciousness. What is that? A lot of philosophers don't think that this is a helpful concept, but I think it's widely accepted and understood. It's the redness of the red, or the ouchiness of the pain. Okay, there's, Thomas Nagel famously said, there's something that it's like to be a creature, right? To be a bat was his example. And we could never know what it's like to be a bat, because the way bats echolocate and their perceptual apparatus and the way they are constructed as creatures is so alien to the way our nervous system is constructed that we could never know what it's like, right? So that, and I mean, some people even say, hey, there are humans that can echolocate, maybe because they have visual disability, whatever, forget about that. The point is, in addition to all of the third person objective scientific description that we give of a complex system, whether that's a brain or a computer system, there's still more, right? And that's phenomenal consciousness. There's the qualitative, subjective inner feeling of what it's like to be that creature, right? A way I explain this to my students, and so I'll ask you the question: is it possible to be in pain and not know you're in pain?
No.
Right. So, but some people would say yes. They'd say, look, you could be in shock, or the pain hasn't hit you yet, so to speak, right? Like you've suffered great bodily damage, but if the paramedic came and asked you, do you feel pain right now? You might say, no, I actually don't feel anything right now, right? And so some people say, well, you're in pain, you just don't feel the pain, or you don't know you're in pain yet. But that's conflating the concept of bodily damage with the concept of pain. To be in pain just is to feel pain. It's a conscious experience. It's a first personal experience.
Yes.
Right. So that's what I mean by consciousness. I mean that lived first person perspective, qualitative, right? The ouchiness of the pain, the redness of the red, right? That's phenomenal consciousness. And so that's what phenomenology as a tradition is interested in. So when we talk about consciousness, we're not talking about behavioral or functional capacities of the brain or of the entire creature. We're talking about that inner life of consciousness, the subjective, qualitative, first person character, phenomenal consciousness. Okay, so that was all roundabout tangent about what I mean by consciousness. I mean phenomenal consciousness. Could we make artificial intelligence that's conscious? Again, I think we could, but but people don't really care about that. That's not what we're after, because we're after artificial general intelligence, right? And intelligence is a functional or a behavioral notion. Intelligence is something we measure in terms of what the thing can do. Can it process natural language and speak to us and respond to our questions intelligently and naturally? Does it have various behavioral abilities, right? Could it fool a human that it's interacting with and the human doesn't know that it's a machine or something like that, right? So when we talk about AI, we mean that. We mean a set of functional and behavioral abilities that match up to human functional and behavioral abilities. Then it's a further question of, does it have some kind of inner qualitative life? Is there a light on inside, right? Does it actually feel pain, right? Again, you could imagine a robot that if its leg is damaged, or if part of its body is damaged, it says ouch, and it pulls its arm back, and it says, I've suffered, it gives a verbal report. It says, oh, like, I've suffered damage to my right arm. Okay, that's still all a set of behavior, and the robot can report on its functional status. It's a further question of, is the robot actually feeling something? Is the robot actually experiencing the ouchiness, the feeling of pain? Okay, I don't think we can rule that out. The position would be neural chauvinism. That's the position that no, only biological creatures, right, with a nervous system, with a biological nervous system like humans and other mammals, that's the only place in the universe that consciousness arises. That's called neural chauvinism. I'm not a neural chauvinist, so I don't think, that consciousness in a non-biological system or some different kind of system, I don't think it's impossible in principle. But I don't think there's nothing that we're currently developing that would give us any reason to believe we're close to creating AI, let alone conscious AI. But look, I mean, maybe if we develop AI that is powered by sufficiently complex mechanisms with silicon and plastic hardware, maybe it could become conscious, or consciousness could arise in that kind of system. And then so we started with what I mean by consciousness. Now we're at, could we make conscious AI, or could we make AI in general? And then the further step of, would AI be conscious? And now, I guess, what the Dalai Lama is addressing about whether it has any kind of moral status or a personhood, I believe was the concept you used. Well, that's a whole nother set of questions. So, I mean, I should say off the bat, I'm not a Buddhist, and I don't believe in reincarnation. So
neither am I.
My personal answer is no. You can't be reincarnated as a conscious machine, but that's just because I don't think you can be reincarnated as anything. So I guess, like, the more interesting thing, I think what the Dalai Lama is getting at there, or whoever it was, is if you practice a religion that does believe in reincarnation, and we create artificial intelligence that is conscious, does it have the same kind of status as other creatures in the hierarchy of things you can be reincarnated as, right? So you could be reincarnated as a human being, maybe you could be reincarnated as an animal. Would AI fit into that? I don't know. I mean, that's a theological question. That's a religious question for those people, for those practitioners. But I guess I think, how should we approach the question of robotic personhood, or personhood or moral status for AI? Well, we already have a way of approaching questions about the moral status and the personhood of other conscious creatures that aren't human, and that's animal ethics, right? So I think animals have ethical standing. Right? I don't think you have to be a Homo sapien to have some kind of ethical standing. I don't think animals have the same ethical standing as human beings, but insofar as animals are conscious creatures that can suffer pain, can experience pain, then I think we have certain ethical obligations to them. I'm not a vegetarian. I eat meat. So clearly I don't think that killing animals is murder. But I think they should be treated a certain way. They shouldn't be subjected to torture. or torturous conditions. And of course, not all animals are the same thing either, right? There's highly complex, sophisticated mammals, and then there's fish, and then there's, bugs and earthworms. And so consciousness, I think, is a scalar notion. I think all of those creatures that I just mentioned have a degree of phenomenal consciousness. They have an inner life of experience. They feel things. But that's different than their degree of intelligence or their degree of subjective awareness. And then those are further conditions you would want to consider for granting the status of personhood to an animal, which, maybe elephants, dolphins, chimpanzees get pretty close to personhood insofar as they have a kind of sophisticated inner life and so on. So yeah, that was a really long, complex answer, but there's just a lot of concepts in there that you kind of have to distinguish.
No, I agree. And there's something that I've been thinking about as far as the AI having consciousness. I know that it's possible for AI to have consciousness, or at least not consciousness, but really phenomenal consciousness, right? But we would never know for certain if it did. Like, for instance, I know that I have phenomenal consciousness. I know that you know.
No, you don't. You don't know that I do, and I don't know that you do.
Yeah, that's correct. You know that you have phenomenal consciousness, but I don't know if you have phenomenal consciousness.
That's correct. Yeah. So the problem about if AI became conscious, how could we ever know? Well, it's the same problem we already have with one another. How do we know animals are conscious? How do you know other human beings are conscious, right? This is called the problem of other minds. It goes back to at least Descartes, probably farther. So what do we have? I mean, we have behavioral evidence. And then there's other kinds of evidence that we could look at. So look, we know that certain kinds of nervous systems are what produce consciousness. We don't know why, we don't know how. That's called the hard problem, right? The hard problem of consciousness is, why does physical matter that is arranged a certain way produce phenomenal consciousness in the first place? We don't know. But we have really good reason to believe it does, because the thing I'm most certain of, the thing I'm most sure of, is my own conscious experience. Okay? So consciousness exists. And we know that when people, we've charted very systematic sets of correlations between brain activity and consciousness. Okay. And we know when people suffer brain damage of different kinds that it alters their conscious experience, right? So yeah, we've studied the correlations between different kinds of brain activity and different kinds of conscious experience in exhaustive detail. So yes, we have every reason to not even say we believe, to say that we know that the brain is what produces consciousness, or the nervous system in general, right? The brain plus the rest of the central nervous system. And so we start from there, right? We start from there, and then we look at other animals, and we say, well, how do we know a dog is conscious? Or how do we know a chimpanzee is conscious? Well, they're mammals, and they have a brain and a nervous system that is similar to ours in many ways, right? So that gives us pretty good reason to believe that they are also conscious. Not maybe their conscious life's not exactly like ours, probably isn't, right? But if you're a warm-blooded mammal with a brain and a nervous system, right? So we start from our own conscious experience, and how it correlates with our observations of brain states, behavioral and functional abilities, right? We chart all those correlations. We build up a science of consciousness that way. And we say, we have every reason to believe that consciousness arises from specific neural mechanisms, right? From specific kind of underlying hardware, right? Mechanisms of the brain and the nervous system. And then we look in nature, we look at other creatures, and we look for those mechanisms, or we look for similar mechanisms. And we see them in mammals, right? And so we have every reason to believe that mammals also have conscious experience, at least to some degree or of some kind, okay? So we would do the same thing with AI. We would, if it started to develop the behavioral and functional abilities that might make one think, wow, this thing is intelligent, this thing is conscious. And then we say, well, are the underlying mechanisms in any way similar to the underlying mechanisms of our own consciousness, right? And maybe they're not similar materially because they're not made of the same, they're not the product of biological evolution, but they may be functionally isomorphic, right? The underlying mechanisms of the AI may have a kind of functional equivalency or functional similarity down to a micro level, like a micro-functional level of similarity to human brain activity. And then that would be some evidence in favor of, okay, not only does it walk like a duck, not only does it quack like a duck, but the underlying mechanisms that drive its walking and its quacking have a kind of similarity to the underlying mechanisms that underlie our own walking and quacking, to use this metaphor, then yeah, like we would have reason to believe, okay, this thing's conscious. But okay, there's always room for that like ultimate Cartesian doubt of, but we don't really know, But of course, we don't really know if one another are conscious, but that would be a kind of absurd doubt to seriously entertain, right? Like, yeah, I don't really know if you, Greg, are conscious, but I'm certainly going to treat you as another conscious creature, because the doubt is so infinitesimally small, right? And I have every reason to believe that you're conscious and treat you accordingly. And so, yeah, AI could get to that level where, like, of course, yes, we'll never really know with absolute, certainty, but we'll have really good reason to believe, and thus we would want to err on the side of treating it as conscious, because we wouldn't want to inflict pain unnecessarily on another creature.
I agree with you, and I appreciate that you're treating me as if I have a consciousness.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Yeah, it's definitely a subject that has a lot of layers. I know I heard this one explanation on the hard problem of consciousness, and
yeah,
I might be getting this wrong on the definition of hard consciousness, or the hard problem of consciousness, but it's kind of, there's this debate between whether or not we are connecting to something like another form of existence, like matter and energy, like consciousness is another form of existence, and whether our brains are really just connecting to that, or if
right.
our brains are creating consciousness just within the brain. It only exists here, not elsewhere.
Yeah. So I think maybe what you're talking about is the view called panpsychism.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the hard problem, as I said before, is this question not of does consciousness arise from physical matter, specifically brains? Because we seem to know with pretty good evidence, we seem to know, yes, it does, right? Clearly, consciousness exists, and we have really good reason to believe that it arises from brain activity. But we don't. But the hard problem is how. How does that happen, or why,
Mm-hmm.
right? because the physical matter that constitutes the brain and the nervous system, it's not anything magical or different than the rest of the universe, right? It's a bunch of carbon and nitrogen and oxygen and whatever, right? It's the same stuff that everything else is made of. But it seems like trees and rocks and, you know, my bookshelf and my coffee mug here, I don't think those things are conscious. But but my brain's not ultimately made of anything different than those things. So how does consciousness arise from physical matter in general? That's the hard problem of consciousness. And then there's just different ways you can go trying to answer it. And so one answer that I think were alluding to is called panpsychism. And, you know, David Chalmers has written about this, but I think the kind of go-to person, there's two people that you should read on panpsychism, Galen Strawson and Philip Goff. And panpsychism is the view that consciousness is a fundamental property of matter in the same way that mass or charge or spin are fundamental properties of matter. Okay. So it's not a form of materialism because we're not reducing consciousness to something else. We're not explaining it away. We're not saying that ultimately consciousness is reducible to these other more fundamental things. We're saying, no, consciousness is fundamental, right? You can't explain it in more basic terms. Consciousness is just a fundamental feature of the universe. Okay. It's woven in at the ground level, just like the fundamental features that physics uses to describe matter. Okay. The difference is physics tells us what matter does. It doesn't tell us what matter is. Okay. So those fundamental properties that I mentioned for physics, like mass and charge and spin, those are actually all behavioral dispositions of matter, right? Those describe how matter behaves in relation to other matter, right? Mass is resistance to acceleration, and so on, right? It doesn't tell us anything about what matter is intrinsically, okay? It just tells us about its structural, behavioral, dispositional properties. So what is matter intrinsically? Well, maybe that's where consciousness enters the story. Maybe consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, is like the intrinsic nature of the physical, whatever physical particles are. So yeah, that means then that sounds kind of wacky, right? Because now we're saying that like electrons are conscious, or whatever the most fundamental, physical constituents of the universe are. Consciousness is to be found in them, right? Or there at that level. That would solve the hard problem, because then it wouldn't be mysterious anymore about why consciousness arises in brain activity, because consciousness is a fundamental feature of all matter, and so consciousness, is to be found everywhere. But there's still it's still weird, and there's still more work to be done, because I don't think the consciousness of the atoms in my coffee mug here, I don't think they have the same kind of subjective inner life as me or my dog, right?
Definitely not.
So there's a problem for panpsychism called the combination problem, and that's the problem of how do little bits of consciousness in different particles add together and combine to form bigger consciousness. We know how that works with physical properties like mass, right? When you combine, when two atoms bond to form a molecule, then the molecular weight is just the sum of the mass of the constituents, right? But does consciousness add up in the same way? Does you take the consciousness of two hydrogens and the consciousness of an oxygen when they form an H2O molecule? Are there still three consciousnesses, or is it one big consciousness, or is there four, the three originals and now the one new one? like, is consciousness a combinatory property, and what would that even mean? So that's kind of weird. But that's going to explain how you would go from consciousness to full-fledged conscious subjectivity with an actual unified point of view. Okay, so that's panpsychism, and I'm not an expert on that, and I'm just kind of rehearsing some of the talking points that I hear panpsychists use. And then the other view that I think you were getting at is consciousness specific to the brain somehow? There's a family of views called like emergence theory, or emergent views of consciousness, where no, consciousness is not found everywhere, like in panpsychism. Consciousness is an emergent property. It emerges from certain kinds of complex physical arrangements of matter, namely the brain. Maybe other things too. Maybe AI, a deep neural network, right? If it becomes sophistically complex, consciousness will be an emergent property from that too. But anyway, the brain, at least, is made of the same stuff as everything else. It's physical matter, but it's incredibly complex, right? And you have electrical patterns of activity and all the interconnections between neurons, right? Billions and trillions of connections. And when you get sufficiently complex patterns of physical matter and activity at the physical level, genuinely novel properties can arise. Something genuinely novel can arise from that. And that's what consciousness is. That's consciousness. So that would, again, consciousness would not be reducible to the physical. It would be its own novel kind of property in the universe. But it would arise from the physical, or supervene on the physical, or be emergent from the physical, or something like that. So I don't really know where I stand on that. I know consciousness exists. I think the hard problem is a real problem. Some philosophers are skeptical of it. They think it's a pseudo problem, or it's not a problem at all. I think it's a real problem. And I think consciousness exists, and I think consciousness somehow exists within the physical universe. So I think panpsychism is interesting. It's an interesting theory to explore, because it seems sufficiently radical to solve the hard problem. But this is all metaphysics. This is all metaphysics, right?
Yes.
And I don't do metaphysics. I teach some of this stuff in philosophy of mind and even intro. But I'm a phenomenologist, so my starting point is consciousness, and I'm not working on the metaphysical problem of how or why does consciousness arise from the physical, or what's the relationship between consciousness and the physical. I just start with consciousness, right? That is the phenomenology. That is the starting point of phenomenology. That consciousness is the field or dimension that actually constitutes the very meaning of physical reality. And so phenomenology tries to study what is the general structure of consciousness, such that it even makes sense for us to talk about a world.
Yes, that's interesting. I know phenomenology is all about having a knowable starting point and moving from there to discover knowledge.
Right.
And it's interesting. I mean, it's still interesting to discuss these things, even if they're unknowable at the moment.
Yeah, it is. It's not only interesting; it's valuable.
Yes.
To reflect on what it is possible to know and what you might have been taking for granted. It's consciousness is deeply mysterious, and yet it's the most familiar, intimate thing. So that's weird. And And we should pause and reflect on that. And maybe, not every waking hour of our day is not, you shouldn't be thinking about it, or maybe you should, and maybe that means you should go be a philosopher. But I think everyone, should stop and actually think about that for a little bit, and take some time to see what people have said about that, systematically, reflect on, well, how do we make sense of consciousness and the natural world as we understand it? It's a very live problem. It's not a settled issue at all. So yeah.
Because I had another question I wanted to ask you, but before I do that, I had another thought.
Sure.
On this subject, and I know these panpsychists, they refer to matter having a fundamental property of consciousness.
Uh-huh.
And that makes sense, but the thing about consciousness is that I think it requires time, right? You experience something over a period of time, right? Because if there wasn't time, then you wouldn't really have an experience if you were frozen time. Because you have to have some sort of experience over time in order to feel that sense of consciousness. And it got me thinking, because energy is that which allows matter to move and express itself over time, right? It's kind of the expression of matter over time, really. And I thought, well, maybe it's more so that consciousness is a fundamental property of energy, not really matter. And I know you're not a physicist, and neither am I, but this is just a thought that I wanted to bounce off your head.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, you're right. I don't really know. I do not know enough to speak with any confidence about matter and energy and how they're ultimately the same thing or what. But I agree, and I like your thought about the necessary temporal dimension of consciousness. Consciousness is necessarily temporal, right? It perdures through time. And so that is something the panpsychist needs to account for. Any theory of consciousness and how it may inhere in matter at that fundamental level will also need to take into account that consciousness has an essentially temporally extended nature, right? That's just what consciousness is. But so is matter, right? Matter perdures through time, right? Matter, yeah. So that's just the nature of everything anyway, right? The world,
yes,
our world doesn't exist. Well, now we're doing the metaphysics of temporal reality. So I keep using this word perdure, which is jargon and unfamiliar probably to a lot of people. Philosophers make in metaphysics of time and temporal reality. Philosophers make a distinction between endurance and perdurance, or to endure and to perdure. So things that endure exist all at once, and things that perdure unfold through time. So they don't exist all at once. You can think of them as four-dimensional growing worms, right? And so if you're an endurantist about the physical universe, you think it all exists all at once, and the passage of time is an illusion of our own minds, not a fundamental feature of reality. If you are a perdurantist, or some people use the term growing block theory, you think the universe is continuously expanding in time, right? And so things exist along a temporal dimension as well as within spatial dimensions, and however many other dimensions there are that the physicists tell us about. again, I'm totally unqualified to speak about any of this with any real authority. But yes, conscious states of consciousness seem to perdure. They don't endure. They don't exist all at once. They unfold through time. And so, hey, maybe that could be an indirect way of arguing that matter also exists in that same way. It unfolds through time. It doesn't exist all at once. But yeah, I mean, that's heavy duty metaphysics. And I'm a phenomenologist, so I look at the structure of conscious experience on its own terms. And Husserl, one of my favorite philosophers and the founder of phenomenology, he did extensive work on this temporal nature of consciousness, this temporal dimension of consciousness. He has a whole series of writings called his writings on inner time consciousness. A set of lectures and notes on the inner time of consciousness, as opposed to the objective time that we measure with clocks. There's the real time unfolding of consciousness. It has its own kind of temporality.
Yeah, I only bring that up because I don't know if you've ever been under anesthesia before, but it really feels like time travel, a lot more so than sleep does, because there's no dreaming.
Yeah.
You just kind of,
Yeah.
you're out and then you're up 4 hours later.
Yeah.
Right. And that really, that experience when I got my wisdom teeth out, that really got me thinking about consciousness and how it does have this temporal like experience.
Yeah.
But
no, that's a limit. It's a limit phenomena for phenomenology. That states of deep sleep or anesthesia like that. I've been under anesthesia as well for surgery, and it is a strange feeling to simply open one's eyes and it's the next day or it's 6 hours later or whatever. It's a break in consciousness. And so phenomenology can't account for it. It's not within phenomenology's purview. Phenomenology can only describe the structure of up until the very last moment, and then upon waking, how is the continuity restored? Right. Well, it's restored through memory, right? But if that happened frequently enough or severely enough, you could have a rupture of consciousness. You could have, be a new person on some accounts. So yeah, how psychological continuity is maintained through those kinds of breaks, that's something phenomenology can talk about and can study.
So I was looking through some of your research and I came across a question. And it was, you mentioned this thing called a cognitive extension, and I want to know what that is.
Yeah, that's a great question. So this was how I kind of got into philosophy of technology.
Okay.
So in I think it was 1998 or 99, 2000, 2001, something like that. I'm going to go with 1998. David Chalmers, who I've mentioned already in this interview, who's a really well-known philosopher of mind, and Andy Clark, another well-known philosopher of mind, they wrote a paper called The Extended Mind. Okay. And so the idea of the extended mind is basically that a piece of technology or an artifact of some kind, like your smartphone or just a notebook that you keep in your pocket and you always record certain things on, can count as part of your mind. So the mind can extend beyond the skin, beyond the skull, into the world through, if the kinds of artifacts or pieces of technology that we couple with, right, that we form kind of reliable functional couplings with. Yeah, so let me say that better. Insofar as we reliably, functionally couple with certain kinds of artifacts, call them cognitive artifacts. If those artifacts come to play a certain kind of functional role that is sufficiently trustworthy, reliable, accurate, and so on, in our cognitive routines, in our processes of thinking or remembering or problem solving, then Clark and Chalmers argue, and many others, that's not just a tool that supplements your cognition. That thing, that artifact, that piece of technology actually is a constituent part of cognition. So our minds extend into the world through the kinds of technologies that we come to rely upon to accomplish various cognitive tasks. That's what cognitive extension is. So to me, that's a fascinating idea as someone who's, a philosopher of mind. And that's how I started. That was kind of my first foray into philosophy of technology. That's really where philosophy of technology and philosophy of mind intersect, among other areas, but that's a really great intersection. How does technology extend? And then a further question would be, how can it enhance our cognition?
So this is sort of the concept of, say, my cell phone enhancing my navigation abilities by allowing me to find out how to get to, say, Winco from here if I don't know how to get there.
So let me put it this way, Greg. Yeah, the smartphone is kind of the best and obvious example. You have a bunch of phone numbers in your phone, right?
Mm-hmm.
Me too, hundreds. Okay. Do you know all those numbers?
Just my mom and my dad's.
But on the extended mind theory, you do know all those numbers. You know them because the phone is part of your mind, right? So knowing them just means you have a certain kind of easy, quick,
I can cut that part out.
Can you? I don't.
What?
Sorry about that. I accidentally turned on Siri on my phone, and my my Spotify started playing. So can you hear me? Is everything okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Anyway, so that's funny. Maybe keep that in for the philosophy of technology jokes.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe I will.
No, look. So the point is, if your phone is always on your person and it's just as trustworthy and accurate as your brain-based memory, and you can you quickly, reliably, easily, trustworthily access those phone numbers that are stored in your phone, how is that any different than you having those numbers memorized? Now, some people want to say, no, it's different. The phone's not part of my mind. But that's what the extended mind theory says, is as long as the artifact ends up playing the same functional role as if you memorize them the old-fashioned way, that's all that matters. All that matters is functional equivalence, right? So yes, you do know those numbers, right? Now, imagine if, have you heard of Elon Musk's new technology, Neuralink, right?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, so imagine if your phone is, the size of a pea and is a brain-machine interface device that's implanted directly into your brain. And you have 500 phone numbers stored on the phone, except now the phone is something implanted directly into your brain. And when I ask you to, I ask you for a phone number, I ask you to bring up a contact, it's just some kind of, the machine, in your brain, right? And it pops into your head. How's that any different functionally than, you have your phone, quick draw, pull it out of your pocket, look up the number, right? So that's what the extended mind wants to get you to think. Or that's what that theory is suggesting, is that, look, All that matters is functional equivalence. All that matters is that it plays a certain kind of trustworthy, reliable, accurate, functional role in a cognitive process. The cognitive process in this case would be remembering phone numbers. And so, yes, you do know those numbers. And like with the Google Maps example or with the navigation example on your phone, I might say, do you know how to get, think of some place you don't know how to drive to. I say, like, do you know how to drive to Fairbanks, Alaska? And you might say, no, I've never driven there before. Except now you should answer, yes, I do know how, because I have this. And the knowledge is here, right? So when people, I've done this, the past few years. People are, if we're going from one place to another, like, after an event at the philosophy department, say a bunch of people are going to some local restaurant and they say, hey, do you know how to get there? Have you ever been there before? It's like, well, no, I've never been there before, but yes, I know how to get there because I have the extended mind in my pocket. Because I know how to get anywhere. I know how to get anywhere because I have this, right? And so it's not just a tool. It's not that I don't know how, but I will consult this resource and then I will learn how. The extended mind theory says, no, cut out that middle step. You do know how because this thing is already thoroughly integrated into your cognitive routines, into your cognitive processes. Now, look, I can quibble and I don't know if I fully agree, right? But that's the idea. And so it's fascinating and that's amazing. And now with brain-machine interface technology becoming more of a reality, we can really start to think about almost science fiction-like examples, science fiction-like futures, of becoming cyborgs, where we do have various pieces of technology directly connected to our brains. And, are those just tools or are those now functional parts of our mind? Right? And so we can not only extend our mind, but we can enhance cognition through these kinds of technologies, right? So there might be certain cognitive extensions that aren't necessarily enhancements. Okay, if the technology does not raise your abilities beyond normal functioning, then it's not an enhancement, right? But if it does elevate your abilities beyond normal functioning, then that's an enhancement. Take a cognitive process like calculation. Now, a calculator counts as part of your extended mind insofar as you can quickly calculate large numbers by having a calculator. Now, imagine the calculator is a brain-machine interface device that's implanted directly in your brain and allows you to, calculate. And, I can say what's 8,478,000 divided by 3.6. And you would know, right? So that's not only a cognitive extension insofar as your mind extends into a supplementary piece of technology, but it's a cognitive enhancement because now your calculative ability is enhanced beyond its previous levels and beyond probably everyone else's too. And so that paper that I think you're mentioning is called Cognitive Extension, Enhancement, and the Phenomenology of Thinking. And so I'm very interested in I'm not so much interested in the metaphysical question of, hey, does your phone really count as part of your mind? A lot of the debate is about that metaphysics of mind question about, like, is it, can technology really be considered part of the mind, or is it just an external tool or just some, external supplement? And there's all these debates about, the concept, is it constitutive or is it complementary or is it a causal scaffold? That's interesting and whatever, but that's kind of not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the phenomenology. I'm interested in, if we have various kinds of technological cognitive extensions, what will that do to what it's like consciously, right? How will that transform or alter the phenomenally conscious experience of thinking, right? Of problem solving, of remembering, of whatever, of any kind of thought process. Because for me, as a phenomenologist, right, I'm interested in what is it like from the first person perspective, from that inner qualitative, subjective, first personal perspective. What is it like to remember a phone number or solve a math problem or whatever, right? Those are mundane examples. And how can these technologies transform the normal kinds of conscious experiences that we take for granted? And is that worth pursuing? Could that, even if they enhance our abilities as they are functionally measured, might they transform our inner lives, transform our subjectivity in a way that's bad, right? Or in a way that actually diminishes our agency or diminishes the degree to which we are skillfully involved in our own thought processes. So yeah, I'm interested in the intersect. That's where all my interests come together, except for Asian philosophy. So I got to somehow bring Confucianism into the mix on this question, but that's where all my interests kind of intersect. Of like, okay, what is the mind, and then how can technology augment the mind or change processes of cognition, and then how does that transform the inner life of consciousness, phenomenal consciousness? And so that I really love that paper, and I keep I've been working on this issue more, but more on my blog. I have a blog called thinkingtech.co. I guess I should plug it while I'm on your podcast. Please check out my blog on philosophy of technology. It's called Thinking Tech. It's thinkingtech.co.
I'll put that in the description.
Thanks so much. And so I have a post on there about cognitive offloading, which again is something I've been describing here, where a piece of technology can end up bearing some of the cognitive burden of a cognitive task like memory or calculation. And even if we remain functionally equivalent or functionally enhanced in virtue of that technology, does it offload the burden of the cognitive task and thus, make us less agentially involved in the cognitive task, diminish our agency, diminish our responsibility for the output of our own cognitive tasks, and so on. So that's cognitive offloading. Just like other kinds of technology enable physical offloading. Cognitive technologies, cognitive extensions can enable cognitive offloading. And this could be a great thing. Some people could celebrate this because it frees up our cognitive resources to be more creative, to pursue more complex kinds of projects. Or it could be a dangerous path in some respects because it will thin out the experience of cognition to such an extent that we become just kind of passive, lazy, mechanistic in our thought processes.
That's definitely something that I'm worried about, as far as us all becoming these mindless drones that use our computers, like in WALL-E, with them all sitting in their chairs and scrolling around.
Let me say something on WALL-E. WALL-E's a really nice and fun illustration of how to think about this question of how technology unburdens us, relieves us of, in general, like it's hard to say all technology has something in common, right? To say that there's some general essence that all technology shares in. But a pretty good candidate is relieving a burden of some kind, right? Making a certain task easier. That's what technology seems to do in general, right? And so a lot of really important technologies in human history have relieved us of certain physical burdens and made certain physical tasks easier or more manageable, or given us more physical power, right? So think of the history of agriculture, or hunting, or building things, making things, right? Technologies, relieve us of various burdens and allow us to overcome ever greater obstacles, right? Same thing happens cognitively, right? The calculator relieves you of a certain cognitive burden, but it frees up your cognitive resources for higher levels of problem solving, right? So I don't think we should give up our calculators, right? I don't think calculators are diminishing our lives or making us into lazy, passive, slouches, right? But Wally is an illustration of, oh, maybe it's good to keep some of the burden, to hang on to some of the burdens of both physical and cognitive tasks. Because if we completely offload all of the burden onto technology, then what are we going to, what's left for us to do? Right? What is left of life for us to be actively engaged and involved with? Right? So we'll just end up laying back, as they quite literally do in Wall-E, right? They're just laying back in their recliners, and their life has become completely passive, right? So I don't think that's going to happen. I think in general, offloading, whether it's a physical burden or a cognitive burden, generally leads to greater creativity and problem solving. But there is that worry. And that's what the movie Wall-E, nicely illustrates. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, so I like that point with Wall-E. And, I'm not a Confucius expert by any means, but I did have a thought on how you could possibly connect Confucius to this other work that you deal with. And I want to hear what you think. And it's essentially, I know that Confucius had a lot to say about duty and how we have a duty to survive, to society. We have a duty to our government. We have a duty to our friends, our family, all the above. And I wondered, well, do we have, say, a duty to ourselves and, say, society to perhaps make sure that we don't end up like Wall-E? What do you think Confucius would think about all this, about technology and about cognitive extensions, physical extensions, and all the things that you do with technology and phenomenology and all that?
That's fascinating. That's very suggestive. I'm not going to try to make broad connections between Confucian philosophy and all the other things we've talked about or things that I'm interested in. But yes, I think your suggestion is on the right track, that Confucius and his students, the Confucian philosophers, certainly would think that we need to exercise a degree of responsibility and propriety with integrating these technologies into our lives and developing these kinds of technologies. So there's a heavy emphasis, right, on self-respect and occupying a certain role, whether that's a role in the family or a role in government or society, and then having specific duties based on that role. And so, there are probably ways in which these kinds of technologies could interfere with those duties, and would be a way of disrespecting oneself and the role one occupies. I'm not really sure what else to say. It's kind of a speculative answer.
Yes.
I'll just leave it at that for now. I'll have to think about it more. But yeah, I think duties to oneself, issues of self-respect and propriety would be the way to make a connection between these two issues.
Well, thank you for that. So do you have anything else you'd like to leave us off with?
No, not really. Thanks for inviting me to do this. And, again, I hope people check out the blog. I started it in February 2021, so it's only a few months old. But I try to post something every week and have a lot of people who have been guest contributors. And so check that out, thinkingtech.co. Otherwise, thanks for having me on, Greg.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for coming on. That is Dr. Philip J. Walsh. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.